as you go through the creation account in Genesis 1, over and over and over and over again in Genesis 1, you get this idea of divisions and distinctions and separation, right? So you get God and the cosmos, and then you get light and dark, and then you get the seas and the dry land, and then you get the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens, right? And so over and over again in Genesis 1, and then you get to the biological life, and you get the distinct species. Each one, he says, after its own kind. So one of the things you're seeing in Genesis is right in Genesis 1, is you're seeing a very strong dualism. Right? A very strong emphasis on distinctions and separations between things. All right? And most importantly, of course, is the distinction of the separation between God and creation. But even within creation, you get these distinctions, male and female, etc. So these are all heavily emphasized in creation. And one of the reasons that he's doing that is because this counters the pagan religions that Israel has been exposed to in Egypt, and that they're going to encounter there when they get into the land of Canaan. Okay. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are finishing up our lessons on worldviews, various worldviews. We've talked about theism, we've talked about deism, we've talked about Islam. Last week we talked about atheism and naturalism, and today I want to talk about what I call continuity and monism. And those are kind of strange terms maybe for you, you're not familiar with them, but I think you'll see that it's actually something we rub shoulders with all the time, we rub up against all the time and encounter with people. In fact, it's kind of interesting because I was, on Friday, I was working in the home of some longtime friends of ours, Christian couple, and as she was talking with me about something, she raised a question that she had about something one of their children had gotten into. And at first, when she first mentioned it to me, she used a term I wasn't familiar with, particular type of Christianity that she referred to, and I said, well, I haven't heard that term before. Can you explain a little bit to me? Can you describe a little bit about what he's into? Turns out it's all the things we're talking about today. So even though the terms may be strange, I think you'll see why we use these terms, or why I use these terms to describe these things as we go forward. So the resources, again, for today, a couple books we've talked about several times before, Corduan's book and Sire's book, and then of course also the Encyclopedia on Apologetics by Geisler. But these other two books are very helpful. The Bible Among the Myths by John Oswalt, in which he talks a lot about Gnosticism and some of these other pagan myths and that sort of thing. And then a particularly helpful book is The Making of the New Spirituality. So he talks about this kind of new spirituality that's kind of taken over in Western culture, become very prevalent in Western culture. So that's a very helpful book to talk about and get informed on these things. So when we're talking about continuity and monism. What we're really talking about is what I call the other worldviews in the Bible, okay? So we have the worldview that the Bible is presenting to us, the theistic Judeo-Christian worldview that the Bible is presenting to us. But throughout the Bible, from the very beginning, the Bible is countering or answering other worldviews. And so we're continually encountering those other worldviews as we go through the Scripture, right? And actually, it starts at the very beginning. It starts in Genesis. It starts in Genesis 1:1. So in Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And what's going on in Genesis, and actually all the way through the Pentateuch, is God is, through Moses, is not only telling us what's true and what's happened and what's, kind of the history of things and what God is doing and what we are to believe, but Moses is also writing what we call a polemic. A polemic is an argument against something, okay? And so when we think about it, the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written by Moses, which means they were written in the wilderness. They were written during that wilderness sojourn of 40 years, right? And so those 5 books are written in the context, and they're written to people who have just come out of a hyper-pagan environment in Egypt, right? And they're going through the wilderness, and they're going to Canaan, which is also permeated with all kinds of paganism. So what is happening in the Pentateuch, and what is happening, particularly I'm thinking now of Genesis, what's happening in Genesis is God, through Moses, is not only telling them what's true, but he's refuting and he's countering the pagan religions that the Israelites have come out of and that they're going to be exposed to when they go into Canaan. So in Genesis 1, verse 1, we get this immediately right off the bat. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there's 2 things that come out there, and then we get a whole lot more of it in Genesis 1, one is the universe had a beginning. Okay? So this is revolutionary. This is not what they heard in Egypt. This is not what they're going to encounter in Canaan. The idea that the cosmos had a beginning. The other thing that you get in Genesis 1:1 is the transcendence of God. That God and the universe are distinct. They're separate. Okay, and so we call this a worldview of transcendence. All right. So as you go through the creation account in Genesis 1. Over and over and over and over again in Genesis 1, you get this idea of divisions and distinctions and separation, right? So you get God and the cosmos, and then you get light and dark, and then you get the seas and the dry land, and then you get the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens, right? And so over and over again in Genesis 1, and then you get to the biological life, and you get the distinct species. Each one, he says, after its own kind. So one of the things you're seeing in Genesis is right in Genesis 1, is you're seeing a very strong dualism. Right? A very strong emphasis on distinctions and separations between things. All right? And most importantly, of course, is the distinction of the separation between God and creation. But even within creation, you get these distinctions, male and female, etc. So these are all heavily emphasized in creation. And one of the reasons that he's doing that is because this counters the pagan religions that Israel has been exposed to in Egypt, and that they're going to encounter there when they get into the land of Canaan. Okay, so then we get to Genesis 3, and we get the first temptation. And what is really the essence of the first temptation is that Satan is trying to convince Eve that she can become what? Like God, right? So what we have right off the bat, the very first temptation, is the attempt to blur the distinction in their minds between them and God. So it's an attempt to blur that transcendence of God. Okay? And so then we go on through Scripture and we counter this all the way through the Bible. So we get even into Romans chapter 1, and Paul is describing the pagan world around him, right? And he says that men worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Actually, the word there, creature, is the word creation. So man worshipped and served the creation as opposed to the Creator. So again, what Paul is wrestling with here is this blurring of this distinction between God and the creation. So these then are the primary competing worldviews that the people of God face all the way through Scripture, and also from that point on down through history. So of course, you get it in the Old Testament because you get the Jews constantly having to deal with the pagan religions around them, or the pagan religions in Babylon and places where they go into captivity and that sort of thing. But you get into the New Testament and you still get it. So once Christianity moves out of that kind of Jewish nursery that it was in, that Jewish context that it was originally in, as it begins to move out into the Gentile world, then it begins to experience this conflict and this confrontation with paganism, with this worldview that I call continuity or monism. Okay, and what's happening in this in these pagan religions is what you repeatedly encounter is this breakdown of distinctions, the breakdown of this idea of separation, the breakdown of the idea, first of all, the transcendence between God and man, but even the breakdown of distinctions between aspects of creation, between male and female, between humans and animals, etc. Okay? So when I start talking about it in those terms, then automatically your mind's going, hey, that's what we're dealing with today, right? We're dealing with the same kind of thing, this breakdown of important distinctions that Scripture emphasizes. So when I use the term continuity, when I use the word monism, what am I talking about? So continuity is just a reference to the idea that everything that exists, everything material that exists, and even the spiritual realities that exist, whatever a particular religion might think of as a spiritual reality, whether it's gods or spirits or whatever it is, that there is some kind of essential continuity between them. They are in some way, in their essence, the same. All right? So there are no fundamental, in continuity, there are no essential distinctions, there are no fundamental distinctions between humanity, between humans and nature, or between humans and nature and God. So all those distinctions tend to one degree or another, become blurred, or in many cases totally eradicated, as you'll see. Okay, so clearly then, this idea of continuity, this kind of blending of all things together, stands in clear opposition to the biblical view of transcendence. And so transcendence is, as we said, it's the fundamental biblical view of God, and it's the basis upon which other distinctions are made in Scripture. Okay? And so this view of transcendence is where you'll typically encounter it, of course, is in Christianity. You'll encounter it in Judaism. You encounter it to some degree in Islam, because Islam has some roots in biblical thought. And you'll encounter it some in deism. So within deism, you get a strong contrast between God and creation, although God is kind of remote. Okay? So where you encounter transcendence are in those religions and worldviews that are derivatives of the Bible. Now what monism is monism is just kind of a higher level of continuity. So in continuity, as I said, there's a continuity, an essential continuity between things. In monism, the word monism comes from the word mono, which is one, right? So in monism, it's sometimes called oneism because in monism, everything is viewed as actually one. Everything is one. So it's not just that the distinctions are blurred. There are no distinctions. I am you, and you am I am God, and God is me, and the rocks are me, and I am God, and the rocks are God, and everything. So everything in monism, everything is one. So what we have then, as Christianity moved out of its kind of Jewish bedrock and moved out into the world, then eventually in the Western world, Christianity gained dominance. And so it eventually began to eclipse paganism. Now, what oftentimes people think is because oftentimes when you read Western history, you read it as simply a history of Christianity's dominance in Western civilization, and it certainly was dominant, and certainly in thought circles and among thinkers and politicians and political leaders and kings and that sort of thing, and among most of the religious leaders. But paganism was still very prevalent and very real all the way through the medieval era. Okay? So you still have a lot of paganism in Western civilization all the way through, but Christianity had become the kind of the dominant worldview. All right, that begins to change, and towards the end of the medieval era, and as we move into what we talked about last week, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, as we move into that area, in that time period, you begin to get then the rise of or the revival of pagan views, pagan worldviews, that sort of thing. So this pagan continuity begins to reassert itself in Western thought. So you get a number of characters. I'm just listing a few here. There are many more, but some of the names that you may be familiar with, you may have encountered before, or that were particularly important, I just wanted to list for you. So one of them is a Dutch philosopher by the name of Spinoza, who is, as you see there, is back in the 17th century. He was an outright advocate of pantheism. So he was a very influential philosopher, and he really promoted this more elevated level of continuity of monism, which is what we see in some forms of pantheism. Another very influential voice was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Of course, you know of him as an American author, but he was basically promoting Hinduism, and that was his spiritual outlook. Then there's this woman, you may not have heard of her before, but she was very influential. She was a Russian immigrant in the latter part of the 19th century, and she was a mystic. She was a spiritist, she was a medium, that type of thing. And she came to America, and she was very influential in advancing this kind of monistic continuity, pantheistic worldview. All right. So she helped found, she was one of the co-founders of an organization that was really promoting this kind of ideology very successfully in America, in the Theosophical Society. And they were, what it did was it was taking Eastern Buddhist thought and Hindu thought, and it was kind of melding it together with certain trends in, as we see there, Western kind of esoteric traditions. Esoteric refers to being kind of mystical or mysterious, that sort of thing. Okay? Then there's this other guy. This guy is a really fascinating character, a guy by the name of Swami Vivekananda. Okay? And this guy was a Hindu. He was from India. But he was kind of a self-appointed missionary to the West. So his goal was to bring Hinduism to the West. Though he was from India, he spoke very eloquent English, and he was, in fact, a very eloquent, very persuasive guy. And so he came to the West, and particularly to America, with the purpose of infusing Western culture with Hindu thought. He was a speaker at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in the 1890s, and he just wowed everybody. People were just really blown away by this guy's eloquence and his persuasiveness and that sort of thing. And then he spent some time just traveling around the United States, speaking in Christian churches and promoting Hindu thought. And his idea was that all religions are true. Okay, all religions are true, but Hinduism is really kind of the mother religion. It's kind of the mother of them all. And so what he sought to do was to convince Christians of the Hindu aspects of their religion that they had lost sight of. All right, and so he was very, 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 very influential there around the turn of the century. Another individual back in the 19th century is a guy you may know of, a guy by the name of Ernst Haeckel, okay? And where you may know of him from is biology class, because it's very possible that when you took biology and you were studying evolution, you would see a picture of what's called Haeckel's embryos. So he had drawn a picture of the embryonic development of vertebrates, and he had used this as an argument, as evidence for evolution. Okay, and it was very, very persuasive to many people. Many people thought, oh, well, yeah, this is conclusive proof of Darwinian evolution. In fact, it turned out his drawings were fraudulent, and they didn't actually represent embryonic development. And most, at least advanced biologists, know that today, but you'll still encounter his drawings from time to time in various biological texts. Okay, but aside from his advancement of evolution, he was a very strong force for this kind of continuity and monistic perspective of things. So he wanted to reject this, what we talked about before, this ontological dualism. So the dualism of spirit versus body, that we have a spirit, we have a soul, and we have a body. He wanted to reject that, and again, he's arguing this kind of monistic view of this, that everything is of a singular essence, everything is one, right? And then also, around the same time, a little later, you get Carl Jung. Okay? So Jung is a very famous psychoanalyst he was Swiss, and he's world famous. He's still referred to today, still used today. But there's some that argue that he was actually more influential in the area of spirituality and worldviews than he was even in psychoanalysis. So he was a real kind of, he was a real advocate of this whole idea of our oneness with God. So God is us and we are God, that sort of thing. And he blends those two together, the psychoanalysis with his monism. And so what he says is that kind of that psychological search for self that we go through trying to discover ourselves is actually a search for the God that is within us, or the gods, plural, that are within us. And he was, interestingly, he was deeply committed to Gnosticism. So I call in the notes there, I call it a Christian heresy. That's probably not the best way to explain it, because Gnosticism was a religion of its own. Okay, but in the 2nd century, it began to penetrate into Christianity, and for a couple hundred years it was fairly influential in Christianity until the church recognized and really labeled it for what it was, which was a heresy. But it didn't start out as a Christian heresy. It started out as its own religion, which eventually penetrated into Christianity, and Jung was a very strong advocate of Gnosticism, and and one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to break down this idea of distinctions between things. And one of the primary areas where he wanted to break down distinctions, doesn't this sound familiar, is the distinction between male and female, right? So in many ways, although this is 120 years ago, this is a very modern concept. It's what we're dealing with today. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to initiate kind of this mass movement of melding things together, blending things together, removing distinctions, particularly in the area of sexuality. So it's really interesting. One of his biographies, a guy by the name of Knoll here, says this about him. He says, "I've come to the conclusion that as an individual, Jung ranks with the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate as the one who successfully undermined Orthodox Christianity and restored polytheism to the Hellenistic world of Western civilization. Jung has succeeded where Julian failed." Julian was a Roman emperor who came shortly after Constantine. So Constantine was, of course, the first what we call Christian emperor. He is the one who legitimized Christianity within the Roman Empire, and then I don't remember, I think there were 2 or 3 emperors after him, and then comes along Julian the Apostate. So Constantine and the ones right after him were Christian emperors, and then comes along Julian, and Julian is a pagan. And so he wants to reassert paganism in the Roman Empire. Well, he wasn't very successful. For one reason, he only lasted for about 1.5 years as emperor. So he wasn't very successful in reinvigorating paganism in the Roman Empire. And what Knoll's point is that what Julian the Apostate failed to do, Jung accomplished by reviving paganism in Western society. And then we get this guy who is really only known for one thing. This guy, Lynn White, he was a medieval historian, and he was a very strong environmentalist. And so this is the middle of the 20th century. And what Lynn White does, he's a scholar, so he's written some things, but he really wasn't well known for anything he did until he wrote a particular paper for Science Magazine. Science Magazine, of course, is one of the 2 leading science journals in the world, along with Nature. And he wrote an article published in Science Magazine in 1967 called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis." So I mentioned that he was an environmentalist, okay? And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain why we were in this ecological crisis that was was a really big issue back in the middle of the 20th century. And what he did is he argued that this exploitation of the environment, this destruction of the environment, was a result of the Christian view of man. So he goes back to Genesis and he says, well, this kind of Judeo-Christian anthropology, this Judeo-Christian view of humanness, that humans are to have dominion over nature, is what has led Western civilization to destroy the environment. Because we felt like we had dominion, we could do anything we wanted to with it, and we could destroy it. Of course, he's incredibly ignorant of what Christian theology is and of the Christian teaching regarding the environment and the creation and that sort of thing. But his idea is man is destroying nature, and that is because of this kind of Western Christian view of man. So what his idea was is what we need to do is we need to reject this Christian view of man having dominion over nature. We need to reject that, all right? And we need to get back to this idea of being one with nature. So this is very influential. So he called for, one of the things he called for was a renewed animism. So you remember we talked about animism being the worship of spirits in nature and viewing everything in nature having its own spirit and that sort of thing. And so he's advocating for animism. And so what he really wants is he wants a new monistic worldview. So he's going back to this idea of monism, that everything is one. All right? So if God exists, he's actually within us, and we are part of him. Okay? And then going further, as we come up closer to modern times, of course, I've got Carl Jung listed there, but also there's a woman by the name of Elaine Pagels, and she has really developed this whole idea of Gnosticism. So she's written the book, the Gnostic Gospels. We'll talk about the Gnostic Gospels when we get into our study of the Bible. But she wrote the Gnostic Gospels, very popular, and she's a very popular advocate of Gnosticism. And then, of course, you're probably all familiar with Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code, although it is ostensibly a novel, he claims it was written on the basis of historical facts. And it, of course, is basically an advocating for essentially Gnosticism. So that's kind of how paganism, after it had been eclipsed by Christianity for so long, once again gains a lot of traction within the culture. And we can see it today all around us, and that's why we need to think about it. So what are some of the ways, some of the expressions of continuity? What are some of the expressions of continuity that we might encounter, just in rubbing shoulders with our neighbors, our friends, like I pointed out, my discussion the other day with family members. Where are we likely to encounter this? Well, we're likely to encounter it in a number of different forms. And I want to stress, I'll come back to this in a few minutes, I want to stress that each one of these expressions is different. Okay, so they have different characteristics, they have different belief systems, but there are certain themes that tend to pop up the same in these various expressions. Okay, so one of them is in animism. So this would be typically in tribal religions, but also in other areas. So we saw some of these advocates that we talked about just now. Were advocating for a return to animism. So typically it's this kind of idea of there being spirits out there and the employment of magic. So magic is used to kind of manipulate the spirits and manipulate the spirit world and that sort of thing. So you get that kind of thing. Then there's New Ageism, and James Herrick, in his book that I mentioned to you, The New Spirituality, he points out that New Ageism has really evolved. So you really don't hear a lot about the New Age today. People don't talk about being New Agers today like they did, say, 30 years ago or whatever. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the New Age is no longer the New Age. It's just the age, right? So when I was growing up and in my earlier years, what was called the New Age then is just the way people think today, oftentimes, and what we encounter. But there are some characteristics of New Ageism. One is a retreat from Western thoughts and values. So actually, within the last couple of years, in fact, we have a very strong movement in academia and also in the popular culture to reject Western civilization. So you hear a lot about how we need to get away from Western civilization, okay? Well, that really isn't new. It's being articulated more specifically, more carefully today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. But it's this idea that we need to get away from Western thought. We need to get away from Western values. And what's the alternative? The alternative is to go back to paganism, okay? And so what they do then in New Age thought, and you'll get this a lot, not just from people who are really into the so-called New Age, but you'll get this from a lot of people today, that we need to incorporate Eastern thought. We need to incorporate these kind of Hindu ideas and pantheistic ideas and that sort of thing. We need to incorporate those. And this is, as I said, permeating the culture so much that it's no longer seen as a separate movement, the New Age movement, which, back in the 60s and the 70s and perhaps in the 80s to some degree, it was a very distinct movement by itself. Now it's become just kind of more the ingrained characteristic of our culture, right? Another expression is just overt pantheism, okay? So we've talked a little bit about pantheism before. Pan means all. Theism, of course, refers to God. And so pantheism is the belief that everything is God and God is everything, all right? And as I point out there, it's often very monistic. It's oftentimes just totally everything is one. So God is identified with the cosmos. Well, who are the pantheists? Well, of course, most Hindus are pantheists in one form or another, and depending on which version of Hinduism, and there's many, they're more pantheistic than others. Some Buddhists are pantheists. Buddhism is not, how should I say it? Buddhism doesn't require you to be a pantheist, okay? It's not an essential belief in Buddhism. But there are some Buddhists who are Hindus, okay? And then, of course, as I mentioned, New Age, Christian Science. So, of course, that's been around now for a number of years. Unity or Unitarianism, Scientology, these are all various expressions of pantheism. Wicca is an expression of pantheism. Oftentimes Wicca gets associated with witchcraft, and that's a mistake. It's not actually witchcraft, but it does incorporate a lot of these kind of pantheistic thoughts and this kind of oneism that we've talked about. And then there's panentheism. So there's pantheism, and then there's panentheism. So pan, all, the prefix "en" in there means in. So God is in everything. So this is different than pantheism. Pantheism is God is everything. Panentheism is God is in everything. So God is essentially in me. God is essentially in the wall. God is essentially in the carpet. But he goes beyond the cosmos. He's more than the cosmos. So in one sense, he transcends the cosmos. So sometimes panentheism is referred to as monistic monotheism. Okay, so it's kind of monotheistic in that there's one God, but it's also monistic in the sense that God is kind of in everything, and everything has a part of God. Okay, we've talked about that before when we talked about the nature of God. So God kind of penetrates everything. God is in everything within the material cosmos, but he extends beyond the cosmos. So in that sense, it would be somewhat similar to theism, to at least that element of theism that sees God beyond the cosmos. And then we have polytheism, okay? Poly meaning many, and again, theism, God. So there are many gods, and you get polytheism in a lot of places. Of course, you get it in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, but where you really get a lot of it is in Egyptian mythology that the Israelites were coming out of, and you also get a lot coming out of India, okay? So those are really the most polytheistic traditions, are in Egypt and India. And polytheism, as many forms of continuity do, but polytheism in particular, views the cosmos as eternal, okay? I keep erasing myself here. So many gods which account for the various forces and features of the world. And one of the things that's interesting is that when they make an image of the god, so what we would think of as an idol, when they make an idol or an image of the god, typically what you'll see in the images is kind of a combination of features of divinity, features of humanness and human beings, so they'll have some kind of a human form to them oftentimes, and also nature. So what you see in their images is a merging together or a blending together of the divine, of nature, and of humanity. And so, and this becomes important when we get into our study on the Bible and contrasting the Bible with the myths. This will become important. But one of the ideas is that the idol actually represents the God, but in one sense is one with the God. So if you're doing something to the image, if you're doing something to the idol, you're doing something to the God. And where you really see this come out in the Bible is the story of Dagon in 1 Samuel, right? So the story of Dagon in 1 Samuel is where the Philistines have stolen the Ark of the Covenant, right? And they've got the Ark of the Covenant, and they keep bringing it into their temple where Dagon is, okay? And Dagon keeps falling over, right? Okay? And so what's happening there is God is causing Dagon to fall over, and then eventually his arms break off and everything. They keep setting him back up. And the idea is that in the mind of the Philistines, what's happening there is Dagon is being dethroned by Yahweh, by the God of the Israelites, right? So you see this element at play, that to the Philistines, the idol really is one with their God, and what's happening to the idol is happening to their God. And so God is just, Yahweh is just playing with them on that. It's kind of it's a funny story, but we see the kind of the mindset that's behind the Philistines in that story. But one of the things, I think it's very easy for us to make the mistake of thinking that polytheism is just kind of a multiple version of a singular God. So we think of a monotheistic God. We think of one God, only one God. And what we tend to do when we think of polytheism is just think, well, he's just a collection of individual gods. All right? But it's more than that in polytheism, because in polytheism you get this element of continuity or oneism. So while you have many gods, in one sense, it's all part of one reality. All right? And then we have Gnosticism, and I've already talked about that a little bit. But in Gnosticism, God is just kind of this inner directing presence that everybody has. So God is in everyone, and He's kind of directing. And so in Gnosticism, what you have to do is you have to figure out how to get in touch with that God. So you need to be enlightened. But how you do that is secret. It's a big secret, and only certain people know the secrets. There are only a few initiates who really know the secrets. So if you want to get the secrets about how to tap into this inner God that's within you, you need to be initiated into the religion, and you need to become, you need to place yourself under these tutors or these teachers who will reveal this hidden knowledge to you. So the word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know. Okay, so Gnosticism is a religion of knowing. It focuses a great deal on this idea of enlightenment, and they had their own writings. They had their own gospels. They told stories about Jesus and Mary and all that sort of thing. But they had this Gnostic theology running through them. And these Gnostic Gospels were discovered, as we'll study in a later lesson, copies of these Gnostic Gospels were discovered in the late 1940s in an area in Egypt. And so they've become a really big deal among Gnostics today, because they're able now to go back and cite these Gnostic Gospels and claim these are really the true Gospels and that sort of thing. And then there's monism. Again, I want to stress all these things overlap, or many of them overlap. So in monism, you have the single essence of all things. The term itself comes from Thomas Haeckel that we talked about earlier. So monism is, as I said, it's a highly developed form of pantheism in which everything, the external reality and God and everything is really just one. And the distinctions that we see, the distinction that I see between myself and the chair, the distinction that I see between myself and you, the distinction that I imagine between myself and God, all of that is an illusion. We're actually really one, okay? And not just kind of in some kind of mystical way. We really are just one. And the reason I'm seeing that chair as something distinct from me is because I'm deluded. And I need to be enlightened to realize that the chair and I are really one. All right? And then we get to really the really extreme forms of monism, and you get this in what's called Vedantic Hinduism, as I said, where all of reality then just becomes an illusion. The chair is an illusion, I'm an illusion, you're an illusion, the camera's an illusion, everything's an illusion, okay? And ultimately we all are just part of this one great, one kind of impersonal force, whatever. So I want to just, in the time we have left, I want to go through then Sire's 8 worldview questions that we've used before as we've looked at other worldviews. But I want to stress again that we have all these different expressions of monism, right? So when I answer the worldview questions, I'm painting with a very broad brush, all right? And as you encounter people from different expressions, you know, whether you count a New Ager or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Gnostic or whatever, they're going to differ on some of these points, okay? So I want to stress that. We're just painting with a very broad brush. So the first question is, what is ultimate reality? And of course, ultimate reality is the oneness, it's nirvana, it's Brahman. So again, it's expressed in various different ways depending on who you're talking to. But again, this idea is that what appears to be this diversity that we see in the world is really all an illusion. And I should probably point out at this point that Darwinism, as scientific as it claims to be, fits right in with this idea, right? Because what Darwinism does is it erases all the distinctions within creation, right? It just blurs all those distinctions in creation. So under Darwinism, humans are no different than apes or cockroaches. We're just a little more advanced, right? So this idea of ultimate reality being just kind of this one great one just permeates our culture. And as I said, some may view then ultimate reality as an illusion. Some may view it as real, but the real things that we see are just primarily, they're just a symbol of the unseen things, all right? So it may be an illusion, it may be real. So what is external reality? What's the nature of external reality? This is, of course, related directly to the first question. God and the universe are one. Like I said, it may be an illusion. In pantheism, it's created out of God. All of the cosmos emanated from God's being. So it just kind of grew out of God as being as distinct from a specific act of creation. Humans, of course, are just part of the one. So we're not in any way particularly significant, but we are part of the one, or we are one. And then you get this idea, you get it in Hinduism, you get it in the New Age, is this idea of Atman is Brahman. Okay, so this is a phrase that they use, Atman is Brahman. And Atman is a reference to the personal soul, your individual spiritual being inside of your body, okay? And Brahman is this kind of infinite, impersonal, kind of ultimate reality out there, okay? So it's not a person, it's just kind of ultimate reality. And so you get this idea of Atman is Brahman. So the soul is one with this ultimate reality, right? Now what's interesting is how that is viewed in the East as opposed to how it is viewed by monist and continuity people in the West. Okay? So in the East, the emphasis is on Brahman. Atman is Brahman. So the emphasis is, I am Brahman, okay? And so the ideal is for me to get enlightened so that I completely lose my individuality and I lose my identity as I get enlightened and I realize I'm not a person, I'm not an individual, I'm just part of Brahman. Okay? So the emphasis is on this Brahman and me losing my identity to become part of Brahman. Well, that doesn't go over very big in the West. Okay? You get to the West and people are highly individualistic, aren't they? And their individuality is very important to them. So to import Hinduism to the West, it has to accommodate for that. So in the West what you get is the emphasis is now on Atman. Atman is Brahman. So when you talk to like pantheists or whatever here in the West, the emphasis tends to be on God is me. Brahman is me, okay? So the emphasis is still on the individual and I am God, okay? Rather than losing my significance and losing my identity in Brahman, I become significant because Brahman is me. So it's kind of an interesting, different way of looking at things. So we are God and God is us. So what happens when we die? Well, in Western New Age monism is the idea again that when you die you just transition into another life form. Okay, but typically that's viewed as another person, so another individual. So in the West it's typically viewed, when I die I'll come back, maybe I'll come back as a beggar or maybe I'll come back as a president, but I'll come back as a person, right? And that's very typical in the West. In the East, however, the individual embodiment really ends, of course, with the death of the body, but the soul, the Atman, survives, but it's no telling how it's going to come back. Okay, so it's going to have there's going to be reincarnation, but I may come back as a king, or I may come back as a cockroach. Okay, and it depends on how well I did in this life. And so in this view then of reality, what happens is there's this ongoing life cycle that just keeps going on. So over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, I will keep coming back in different forms. I'll be reincarnated in a different form. And this just goes on for and hopefully someday I'll be able to spin off and become one with Brahman. Okay. I'll be able to really come to the point where I'm enlightened and I recognize that I really am just part of the Great One. But until that happens, I'm going to keep living in this illusion of being in some kind of a form, whether it's the form of an insect or the form of some kind of great person. So the question is, how do we know this? How do we know anything? And particularly, how do we know these things are true? Okay? So it can only come through some kind of form of enlightenment. So you can't know these things are true by revelation, because there is no personal God revealing things to people. Okay? So you can't know it through revelation, and you can't know it through human reason. All right? And you can't know it through any kind of empirical evidence, because all of that stuff is an illusion, right? So you can't know it that way. So how are you going to know it? Okay? How are you going to discover the truthfulness of these things? And this is where the whole idea of spirit guides comes in. Okay? The only way I can know that this stuff is true is if somebody who's experienced it tells me it's true. Then the question comes up, how do I know they've experienced it? And how do I know that whatever they have experienced, they have properly interpreted their experience? Okay? So we have spirit guides, and the spirit guide may be actually a person. So it may be a guru or a shaman or somebody like that, or it may actually be viewed as a spirit. Okay? So So, for example, Carl Jung had a spirit guide. He called him Philemon. He said his name was Philemon. But he was a spirit. He wasn't a person. He was a spirit to whom Carl would go to be guided and to be led into a fuller understanding of this spiritual reality. Okay? So, what you can see then is it's really a seller's market, isn't it? It's a seller's market, because I have no way as a buyer of knowing whether or not this stuff is true. I'm completely dependent upon the seller and what the seller tells me, all right? And so it really is a seller's market, which means it's caveat emptor, folks. It's buyer beware, all right? Because this guy's telling me, okay, I have this spirit guide, and this spirit guide is telling me something, and now I'm telling, but how do I know that spirit guide is a good spirit? How do I know it's not a demon? Right? Or if I have a spirit guide, I have some spiritual being that I consult with, how do I know that spirit is good? How do I know that spirit is not a devil and is leading me down some kind of destructive path? So it really is a buyer beware atmosphere, which stands in stark contrast to Christianity. Because one of the outstanding things about Christianity is it's testable. We can test the truthfulness of Christianity. That's what we're doing in this whole course, the whole apologetics course, is we're looking for the evidence we have, in addition to the Bible, the evidences that we have for the truthfulness of the Christian faith, right? And of course, the ultimate point of testability with Christianity is the resurrection. And we'll get to that at the end of our apologetics year. But so, excuse me, I keep going backwards here. So what is the basis of morality and ethics? Well, if there are no distinctions, there is no morality. Okay? If you don't have a distinction, if there are no distinctions, there's no distinction between good and bad. Right? So moral behavior then just simply becomes, just a utilitarian thing that I do to get along. All right? But if evil isn't, if there's no distinction between good and evil, and if evil is an illusion, then good is also an illusion. If there is no evil, there is no good. Okay? It's kind of the flip of what we've been talking about with the atheists. Okay? The atheist says there is evil, and so if there is evil, there has to be good. Well, the flip side of that is if there is no evil, there is no good. All right? So their view of history, of course, is that everything is eternal. The cosmos is eternal. All reality is eternal. And so history is circular. So we've talked a lot about linear views of history, that history has a beginning and it has an end to which it's moving. Okay? In this view, history is circular. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. The cosmos is eternal, and we are caught in this life cycle of just eternally going around in this circle and just constantly being reincarnated in one form or another. Okay? So clearly this whole idea of reincarnation is connected with this idea of the circularity of history. So what you get then is you get, again, between the East and the West, you get kind of two distinct ways of seeing things. So in the East, there's really not much thought about history or where history's going. Okay, this is historically speaking. Of course, now as there's more penetration of Western thought in the East, you get a little bit more of this. But initially, there's not a lot of thought about history, what happened in the past or where history is going. But here in the West, we're much more inclined to think about it. So even with people who embrace continuity and monism in the West, when they embrace it, they're still thinking about what's the future, okay? And so you get this whole thing that we got with the New Age movement, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, okay? So you have that song, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, is this idea of we're ushering in, by everybody getting enlightened, we're ushering in this glorious new age. So that's history. So what are the core commitments? Well, really your only real core commitment is to get enlightened. Because you can get enlightened, you can shed this world, and you can become realize that you're one with the ultimate. Morality is, as I said, utilitarian. So I have then here just a number of talking points that you can engage in with people who hold to this kind of pagan worldview. So one thing you can talk about is the universe eternal, okay? And now we have, of course, as we'll be seeing here in a few weeks, we have all kinds of scientific evidence that the universe is not eternal, that it did have a beginning. You can talk with people about the whole issue of suffering and evil. And is their view of suffering and evil as an illusion, is that really satisfactory to them? You can talk about some of the self-defeating aspects of pantheism. So you can talk about if the one is changeless, as they say he is, he's changeless, then if I'm part of the one, then how can I change? And if I'm supposed to get enlightened, how can that happen if I'm part of a changeless one? And further, if I'm deceived and unenlightened, then how can I know pantheism is true? How would it be possible for me to ever know pantheism is true? Unless, again, like I say, I'm dependent upon some kind of spirit guide or guru or somebody to tell me. If all of reality is an illusion, what is it an illusion of? Illusions are in contrast to something that's real. So what is the reality of which all of this reality is supposedly an illusion? And then, of course, there's the whole problem, morality of good and evil. And then, is there any kind of historical evidence? Is there any kind of empirical evidence that I can look to that helps me know that your pantheism or your monism or your continuity or your polytheism, how can I know that's true? Is there anything I can look at that really can show me that it's true? And then, of course, we can stress just this whole doctrine, the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, that God created out of nothing. And we can demonstrate through that the transcendence of God. So those are just some of the things that we can talk about. So next week we go into a new module. We're going to delve into science. Our first lesson on science, we're just going to look at science generally. What is science? What isn't it? What can science do? And what are some things that science can't do? Those are some of the things we need to get a foundational understanding of before we start looking at things like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of humans, and things like that we'll look at over the next few weeks. So that's where we're going. So, thank you all.